Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me. This is Psych 92, Developmental Psychology. Today, we're going to talk about Chapter 2, Heredity, Prenatal Development, and Birth. I will stop it after heredity and then another recording for prenatal development and then another one for birth so that you can break up whichever component you want to look at. Okay, so we're going to look at genes and genetic influences. That would be the heredity component. Prenatal development are the different stages as a child is, getting ready to be born, and then the birth process is the shortest component. So when we talk about heredity, what we're really looking at is biological inheritance. What are you getting as a person from your parents and your ancestors? It's so I'm sure many of you have heard of the term evolution. That's sort of the idea that we are changing, and the change is to increase one of two possibilities. Increase reproduction, meaning that the changes that our species is going through helps us produce healthier babies, or more often. And the other part is survival. So those are the two main functions of animals, right? To reproduce their species and to survive the current, the environment. So when we talk about heredity, we're talking about the transmission of biological characteristics from one generation to the next. And that part's really important to consider. So when we think about heredity, there are certain terms you need to know. A gene is really a recipe for making proteins that our bodies need. So proteins are what affect the structure and function of a cell. We have about 20,500 genes. This is from the Human Genome Project. So a gene is a section of a chromosome. A chromosome is a molecule of DNA, and the DNA molecule, that's the double helix that you see there, that takes that form of like the two connected strands that spiral around each other. And so those little colored components, that is what we're looking at in terms of the chromosomes and the proteins that that build humans. You don't need to know the exact composition of our genetic DNA. It's obviously 20,500 genes. You don't need to know that, but you should know the difference between a gene, a chromosome, and DNA. So a gene is part of a chromosome. A chromosome is a molecule of DNA. All right, so two terms to know when we talk about genetic inheritance. There is genotype, which is the set of genes that you have in you, right? So genes are those instructions that really tell as we're forming, as we're babies, it indicates how we're going to become who we are, whether we have blue eyes or brown eyes, the hair, all those individual traits. That comes from our genotype. Phenotype are the individual's actual traits. So it could be, those are features that are actually expressed. So we can have genes, we have the genetic possibilities for certain things, especially if, because we get genes from our father and we get genes from our mother. And so within us, there is the potential to have characteristics from both. But what is actually expressed could be only from mom, only from dad, or an interesting mix of the two. So phenotype is what people see, the expression of the genes. Genotype is the actual composition of the genes. And so you could be blue-eyed, but have a genotype that indicates blue-eyed, but have a genotype. Oops, sorry, that's kind of odd. Okay. Any questions between genotype and phenotype? So natural selection is the theory that Darwin proposed way back in 1859. And what he was saying was that people evolve in a way that either, as I mentioned, enhances reproduction or survival. So in Darwin's observations, he looked at changes that occurred in finches that were completely based on survival. Remember, he went to the Galapagos Islands, and what he noticed was that each island had finches, that's a species of bird, but based on the food available on each of those islands, the finches evolved different types of beaks. So that is what we would call phenotypic adaptation. So genetically, it still said, okay, you're going to form this beak, right? But then the way that the beaks were expressed differed on each island based on the type of food available. Why? Because the finches who did not develop those special beaks for the food available, they died. They did not survive the environment. And so you can see here that the beak size, the shape and size really depended on what food there was available. Leaves, insects, seeds, buds, and grubs. So see that the shape of the beak all differed. And that was what we call phenotypic adaptation. So the more adaptations a species can make to survive the environment, that increases their likelihood of reproducing, of living longer and being able to reproduce. And that's really what Darwin was highlighting, was that those are our main purposes. That's a species purpose. And natural selection means that those who are able to adapt to the environment are naturally going to survive and reproduce more than those who do not adapt properly. That's where the idea of survival of the fittest comes up. This also highlights that need for phenotypic variation. Look at this, 1, 2, 3, there's 6 different types of beaks, all for the same species of bird. That phenotypic variation actually served to enhance the ability of finches to continue to live as a species. So even for humans, this is why, you know, sometimes certain cultures are like, okay, you can only marry within your culture. That actually is not a good idea, because what you want is the phenotypic variation, biodiversity. Can we please make sure you're mute unless you're asking a question? Any questions about phenotypic variation, natural selection?
Hi, good morning, Professor.
Morning.
I did not understand the phenotypic variation part.
So phenotype, remember, is the expression of the genes. So the shape and size of a beak is an expression of a gene that talks about beaks. Phenotypic variation, if you look at this picture, each of these birds has a different type of beak.
Right.
That's the variation that we're talking about. If they were not able to evolve and have these different types of beaks, then they would have died out on certain islands because it was based on the type of food. So the phenotypic variation is an essential part to the survival of a species.
Right. Okay, so there's a component that the body is assessing the change in the environment and the genes are changing accordingly, or the expression is changing accordingly.
The expression of the genes is changing. So what happens is that it's a mutation. The genes are changing. It's a mutation, right? So the birds that did not mutate their beaks to accommodate the type of food available, they died.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. This is also why a lot of research has indicated that mixed heritage offspring tend to be healthier than offspring from people of the same race because of that phenotypic variation. So another 2 terms that's important. So I will post these slides so that you can have the link, are mitosis and meiosis. So these are both processes that occur in our bodies. Meiosis is the process that results in what we call haploid cells. These are cells that only have half of the chromosomes available. That's the sperm cell or the egg cell. That is the only purpose of meiosis. Every other kind of growth in our body occurs because of mitosis. So mitosis results in diploid cells. So there's exact copies of the chromosomes. Meiosis, the only purpose, again, is to produce egg cells or sperm cells, which are what we need for reproduction, right? Mitosis is for the growth of everything else. So when you hear the word soma, that means body. All the other cells in our body occur because of mitosis. Only the sperm cell or egg cell occurs because of meiosis. Meiosis is important because if meiosis did not occur and split the chromosomes in half, we would end up with too many chromosomes, right? We would have way too many, and then that would result in a lot of abnormalities. So this is what makes our that's what makes the phenotypic variation actually possible, because we're getting information, genetic information from both our father and our mother. So here is a graph that kind of shows it. So on the top one is mitosis. All cells, except those used in sexual reproduction, are created by mitosis. So what happens? The chromosomes just make a duplicate copy, right? There you have blue and you have pinks. I guess the blue represents father and pink is from the mom. Makes a copy of both, and then you have from one cell, now you have two cells after the copy is made. So they're exact copies. That's why it's just growth. Meiosis, on the other hand, you have the cell from the father and the mother. It splits them into two. And then there's something called crossover that happens, which is why you get that mix of genetics from both your father and your mother. Even twins have very, very slight variation. They're genetically identical, but we even find, I'm sure you've seen some identical twins who, when they're adults, they look a little bit different, right? So that can happen as well. Just remember, meiosis, that's our sex cells, sperm and egg cells. Mitosis, think maybe you could think Ch2, that's duplication, that's for growth. Any questions about mitosis or meiosis? And I have the video that more explicitly shows how different they are.
No questions.
Okay. So with human reproduction, you have the two germ cells, the egg and the sperm, and they come together. So you get 23 chromosomes from the father, 23 chromosomes from the mother, and you end up with 46 chromosomes. With mitosis, right, it just has the 46. It just keeps passing on the 46 chromosomes. With meiosis, it splits it so that you have some from both. And here's just kind of an illustration where you have the sperm joining with the egg, and then you have the fertilized egg, and there's the embryo. And we'll talk about what happens at each stage in the prenatal development component. So just know at first, when the egg first joins with the sperm cell, it is called a zygote, right? That actually marks the beginning of one of the stages of prenatal development. And then as it grows, so that after all this part, the 2-cell growth, 4-cell stage up to blastocyst and continues, that is all through mitosis. Meiosis is not happening here. Now, I mentioned it earlier that sometimes, you end up having multiple births. So the two types of twins, one is called identical or monozygotic. The term mono means one, meaning from one zygote, right? Over here, you see there's the zygote. So identical twins start off with just one zygote that splits into two. They share the same placenta. So placenta is a part of the woman's body that nurtures and feeds the cell when it's been conceived. On the other hand, there are fraternal twins. They're also called dizygotic twins. Di meaning two, so two zygotes. So fraternal twins genetically are as similar as every other sibling, right? They're not because they came from two different cells. It's just that they're developing at the same time in the womb, but they are genetically similar to each other, the same as every other sibling. On the other hand, identical twins share the same genetic composition because they were from the same zygote that split into two. So with fraternal twins, you have separate placentas. Many times, like we've seen an increase in the frequency of fraternal twins because when a woman takes fertility pills, a lot of times what will happen is two eggs get released or multiple eggs get released at the same time. And so if they all get fertilized, then you're going to end up with multiple births. There is a genetic component, though, also to both. There's a genetic component, a predisposition to having identical twins. So you'll find that in families that, oh, wow, there's several generations of twins. But there's also a genetic component for releasing more than one egg at a time. So it's really hard to tell. Don't make the assumption that if somebody has fraternal twins that it's because of fertility pills, because that may not necessarily be true. It's just that we've seen in society an increase in the frequency of, fraternal twins or multiple births because of the component of fertility pills. Any questions? So know the difference that monozygotic twins are identical twins. They come from the same zygote, right? Monozygotic, so one zygote. And then fraternal twins are dizygotic. Di meaning two, and two, so two zygotes.
In fraternal twins, other than the fertility pills, there's no obvious cause for the separate placentas. I mean, the dizygotic.
Well, the separate placentas are actually triggered by the two zygotes that are that have been,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. All right.
Any other questions? Okay, so there you can see monozygotic and dizygotic. So if you see a brother and a sister and they're twins, automatically you know that they are dizygotic twins. Here's also a picture of the chromosome pairs. So sometimes we don't really get into it because this is normative development. You may find some chromosomal abnormalities that occur, right? When you have so many divisions, right? It can happen. A mutation can happen or an abnormality can occur. And the truth is that the older a woman is, the more likely that that can occur. What's interesting, if you look at the X and the Y chromosome, that's the 23rd pair. It's always this 23rd pair. The X chromosome is actually much larger than the Y chromosome. Because of this, males tend to have more genetically caused diseases than females. There isn't a lot of room on the Y chromosome for variation, or so males tend to be more susceptible to certain illnesses than females simply because of the difference in the size of the chromosome. Okay. So if a person is homozygous for a genotype, then that means they got the same type of gene from both parents. So it's also called an allele. A type of gene is an allele. So if they have it from both parents, then they're going to express the trait, right? There isn't really so if both parents are redheaded, the child will be redheaded, right? They both have that expression. On the other hand, if you're heterozygous for a genotype, which is going to happen, especially if you are a mixed heritage child, the person is going to have different alleles, and it's the different alleles that produce the phenotypic variation. So an individual who has different alleles, from their parents could express one from their the dominant trait, right? So certain traits are going to be dominant. For example, brown hair is a dominant trait, and red hair is a recessive trait. It could be an intermediate trait, which is sort of a mix of the both, or it could of both alleles. And you could also have both traits. Incomplete dominance happens when you have a dominant trait, but for some reason, it doesn't completely suppress the recessive one. And that could result in some certain illnesses. So sickle cell anemia is a genetic illness that occurs because the dominant trait, the healthier type of cells, are not fully suppressing the ones that are shaped differently. It's called sickle cell anemia because the shape of the cell looks like a sickle instead of being, oval. So here's an example where, dad has vertical lines, mom has horizontal lines, and the baby comes out checkered, right? So it is very much true that babies may seem to look like one parent, and as they get older, they look like the other. And that's because they have different alleles, and it starts to get expressed. And we'll talk about that gene environment expression as well. So there is an interaction. We talk about nature and nurture. The truth is it's always nature and nurture. Right now, what we're talking about is the nature part. But as we have this discussion about heredity and prenatal development, I hope you see how much nurture does play a role in forming who we are as people. So phenotypic plasticity We talked about this in the first class. Plasticity is sort of resilience. It's the ability for somebody to adapt to differences, right? So phenotypic plasticity is how much can a genotype change, right? How much can it change? So plasticity allows for adaptation to the environment. There are certain traits that are highly plastic and others that are low in plasticity. A polygenic trait is one that requires multiple genes to be, like, it's influenced by multiple genes. A monogenic trait is one that only requires one gene to be expressed. Now, there are certain characteristics that we thought were monogenic, but apparently have some polygenic components. An example of that is being able to curl your tongue. So some people cannot curl their tongue. And for a very long time, we thought that was a monogenic trait, like that was one gene that determined whether or not you could curl your tongue. Apparently, that's not necessarily true. Earlobes, whether your earlobes are attached or if they are kind of separate from your ears, that's another trait that people look at in terms of considered oftentimes monogenic. Now, if a trait is highly plastic, it means it's very susceptible to change based on the environment. And so when a mom is pregnant with a child, and we're talking about highly plastic traits, what she eats, her stress level, if she's exposed to pollutants, all of that will influence these highly plastic traits. On the other hand, there are components that have low plasticity. No matter what is happening, it's going to develop that way. So a canalized trait would be something like eye color or hair color. That really, that's determined by the genes, and no matter what mom eats, it's not going to change the hair color of the child, right? That's what we mean by canalized. So here's a picture of the earlobes. So there are free earlobes and attached earlobes. Eye color is considered polygenic, which is why you could have, dad with brown eyes, mom with blue eyes, and baby with hazel eyes, right? It could be a number of influences, or it could even be influences from grandparents, recessive genes coming from their grandparents. What you should know is that there's something called a reaction range. So reaction range is your potential as a person. For example, if you had parents, both of them are 6 feet tall, the reaction range for the children they have is going to range on the higher end of the scale, right? So maybe the children will have the potential to be anywhere from 5'9" to 6'4". That's the reaction range. That is determined by nature. Nurture determines where in that range you're going to fall. So even if your parents are both over 6 feet tall and you don't sleep much, as a child, you didn't get much sleep, didn't eat good food, all those things, then the child could end up being on the low end of that reaction range and maybe only grow up to be 5'9", right? That's the nurture component. On the other hand, let's say you have two parents who are more medium height, maybe, anywhere from 5 feet to 5'10". So their children have that reaction range where it would be, maybe from 4'8" to maybe only 6 feet. But if their child sleeps a lot, has really good nutritious food, has the protein, does everything right, that child from the parents who are shorter than the ones who were 6 feet tall, their child could end up taller than the one who had the tall parents. It all depends on the nurture component. So nurture determines where in that range the person falls, but nature is what determines the range itself. Any questions about this? So here are some examples of traits that are canalized versus plastic. Canalized, think of a canal, one way, right? So certain components have to be canalized just so that babies develop properly, right? So things like babbling, the age at which a child starts emitting sounds and everything, that's pretty canalized. We're pretty, we can predict that very easily. On the other hand, things like intelligence, that's sort of in between, right? So there's a nature nurture component, 50% roughly is nature, but nurture has to do with environment. And then personality is something that is more on the plastic side. So a lot of things can change a person's personality. So they might start off, temperament is very changeable. When we talk about temperament for babies, we're talking about, are they easy? Do they like people? Do they adapt to change easily? Or are they difficult where they're crying about everything? It's wonderful that temperament is actually plastic, because if you start off with a baby who cries all the time, the fact that it's plastic suggests that parents can actually adjust that temperament of the child to make them much more easy, as long as they're meeting their needs and finding out what it is that calms them down. So this is just, these are just examples of traits that are plastic, meaning very changeable by nurture, and others that are canalized, meaning that, it's pretty much a set pattern of what it is that is going to develop in the person. Any questions about this one?
Yes, just one thing. So as we see the canalized and plastic, this arrow, it is also going from nature to nurture, towards from babbling to temperament.
So it's bi-directional. So what you're seeing is that the arrow goes two ways, right?
Yeah.
The reason that happens, again, is sort of if what I was talking about, the reaction range and where you're falling in it. So height is an example of something that the way that the timing of growth is canalized, right? It's a very predictable pattern. No matter what is happening, the child is going to grow.
Hmm.
The plasticity component is how tall they're going to get, that part. So there's always that, it's bi-directional because it's always a combination of nature and nurture. But these things like babbling are much more canalized. They're much more set in their development than something like personality. Personality is a mix of both, because we might have a genetic component of maybe being maybe in our brains, right? Or we have a tendency towards being able to visualize things well. But on the other hand, so that would be the brain. And we found out that the brain is actually very plastic. Cab drivers
Hmm.
can grow their parietal lobe, right? So all of these things, it's that interaction of nature and nurture. But some components are going to be more nature, but still have an element that is influenced by the environment.
Okay. All right. I'm gonna take some time to absorb that, but yeah, it was interesting. Thank
Yeah, it's really fascinating, because there are things that we thought were only nature, and it turns out,
Yeah.
because of what's happening with mom and in the development of the womb, there's a nurture environmental component too.
Right. So much. Yeah.
So when we study heritability, which I think is just fascinating, we love to look at families, and it's different family compositions. So families, we'll look at it because they have the same environment and similar genetics. Not same, but similar. We love twins because they have the same environment and genetics. We're also fascinated by twins who are separated at birth, right? And then we find out how similar they are as well. We also look at adoptions because that gives us information when people have the same environment but different genetics. So when we study heritability, we really take a look at different family compositions. The gold standard for studying heritability are identical twins, because they have 100% of the same genetics. So it's really fascinating when, something happens and it turns out that they were, separated at birth, to see what kind of similarities, because that really gives a strong indication of genetic predispositions and the genetic component. Any questions about this one? Okay, so behavioral genetics is that kind of the scientific study of that interplay between the genetic and the environment. So genotype environment correlations, there are three that you need to know. A genotype environment correlation is how the genetic factors contribute to variations, or are affected by variations in environment. So passive is when children inherit their genes and the environment their family provides. They just kind of inherit it and don't do anything with it, though it's why it's called passive. Evocative, on the other hand, if the child has inherited characteristics and it affects the environment, the experience. So it evokes certain reactions from people. An example for this is maybe the child inherits being very, very tall. And so when they come into school, coaches get all excited and like, hey, you want to come play basketball? So an inherited characteristic evokes reactions from the environment. That's what we mean by evocative. And the last one is active, where individuals seek out environments that support their genetic tendencies. An example is a child maybe whose parents are both musicians, and they're like, hey, I bet I have a musical tendency. I want to go learn how to play piano, go, mom and dad buy me a guitar, that kind of thing. So that is somebody who's who's actively seeking out opportunities that will help enhance genetic characteristics that they have. So those are three. So you should be able to come up with examples: passive, evocative, and active. So remember, passive is just, gladly accepting whatever environment that the parents provide. So they have their genes, they have the environment. Okay, they're not doing anything with it. Evocative is when they have certain characteristics that were inherited, so genetic characteristics that elicits a response from the environment somehow. And then active is the person actually going out and looking for opportunities that will help enhance some genetic characteristics or gifts that they have. So genotype environment interactions, that's really like, what is the genetic susceptibility for environment? Parenting style could be something that you might say is evocative, right? Because maybe the child has a certain predisposition to cry a lot or something, that they're highly sensitive. Then that child who cries a lot more than their siblings is going to evoke a different response from their parents. So even parenting is something that's bidirectional. Epigenetics those are the studies that are conducted that look at, DNA modifications and how they affect expression in somebody, and how are those modifications passed on when the cells divide. So that's part of the epigenetics component. And the discussion this week, of course, had to do with the CRISPR as well. So environmental factors, remember, that includes things like stress, type of stress that people are under, nutrition, pollution. So there are all many different environmental factors that can actually affect the growth and development and even genetic expression when a mom is pregnant. So all of this we'll talk about in the next part, which is prenatal development. But those are the main terms that you should be aware of in terms of heredity. So know the difference, gene, chromosome, DNA, alleles, monozygotic, dizygotic, meiosis, mitosis. You have these different traits, interactions, passive, evocative, and active. So make sure you take a look at especially the terminology, that you understand the differences among them. Are there
Excuse
any?
me? Sorry, Professor. I couldn't understand quite well the passive one. Okay, because it was too fast. I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, no worries. So passive is just that the child, doesn't do, it's called passive because they're not doing anything special with whatever gifts that they have, the genetic gifts. So even if, let's say parents are musicians, right? And they're like, okay, here, you're going to take piano lessons. The child's like, okay, they just, whatever parents decide to provide to them, they will willingly take it. They are not seeking it themselves. So passive is when parents, provide an environment and the child just takes it as it is, and that's it. Evocative is if there's something about the child genetically, a genetic characteristic that elicits a response from the environment. So oftentimes it's going to be something physical and observable, like hair color, like height, like beauty, things like that. That could evoke responses from people around them. Active, to contrast passive and active, is when the child seeks out opportunities. So in the passive one, if the parent said, okay, you're going to learn piano, and the child says, okay. An active child, on the other hand, would say, not only do I want to learn piano, I want to learn how to play guitar, drums, all these other things. It's coming from the person. And so an active correlation, an active behavior for that would be the person who has these characteristics are aware of their gifts and want to actively find opportunities to enhance them. Whereas the passive one doesn't do anything and counts on parents to just provide whatever environment it is they have. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you for going back.
Sure, you're welcome. So I'm going to stop this recording so that we can go on to the next one.